So how do we take a fearless and moral inventory? There are three particular areas of which we will be addressing in this: resentments, fears, and sex conduct and harm. Let's look at the resentment sheet, please. It says here, resentment is the number one offender. Well, I mean, he hits me with the bat right over here. Resentment is the number one offender. I always thought that an open internet was the number one offender. I always thought that it was the YouTubes and the pop-up ads were the number one offender. I always thought that Netflix, and I could get away with watching some racy scenes in a Netflix movie, was the number one offender. No. Resentment is the number one offender. Bill explains, "From it stems all forms of spiritual disease. For we have not only been mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. In dealing with resentments, we set them down on paper. We list people, institutions, or principles with whom we were angry. We asked ourselves, why were we angry? In most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt and threatened. So we were sore, we were burned up. On our grudge list, on our resentment sheet, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal and sex relations which had been interfered with? So we learn more about this. You'll have to see this on page 65 of the big book. And now we understand why we have a resentment sheet that looks as follows. As you'll see, there are 4 columns on every resentment sheet. The first column being, I'm resentful at. This is where we name a person. Column number 2 is the cause. What did they do to me? Column number 3 is how the hell does it make me feel? It affects my. And column number 4 is what's my part in it. Basically, you'll find, I believe, that we pretty much live our lives in 3 columns. In other words, who is it? What did they do to me? And how did it make me feel? And generally, that's what it takes to make me go act out, resentments. So we're going to, Bill Wilson gives us a few examples on page 65. He says, I'm resentful at, this is column number 1, Mr. Brown. Column number 2, the cause, his attention to my wife. Told my wife of my mistress. Third thing, Brown may get my job at the office. Column number 4, it affects my sex relations, self-esteem, security, personal relationships. And he continues with an example of Mrs. Jones, my employer, my wife. We put them all down there, everybody that we're resentful towards, really everybody that upsets us. And it includes things like who annoys me, who disappoints me, whom I'm frustrated with and felt neglected by, felt intimidated by. These are all individuals. We have to get in touch with our emotion of resentment. That's all it is. We have to get in touch because that's the source of the unmanageability of our life. These people, these institutions, these situations, and what people and institutions do to me gets me piping mad, angry, bitter, furious. How does it affect me? In column number 3, we learn it affects my pride. By golly, when Mr. Brown gives a lot of attention to my wife, that affects my pride. I get upset about that. What's Mr. Brown doing paying attention to my wife? Relationships. Well, I don't have much of a relationship with Mr. Brown or my wife in that situation. It affects my material security. Never mind that Mr. Brown is a coworker of mine. He's trying to get my job and he's trying to get my wife. That affects my material security. My emotional security. This is all column 3, subsets of column number 3. It affects my emotional security. I'm losing my confidence and my self-esteem. Column 3 continues with healthy sex. How does Mr. Brown and having attraction towards my wife affects my healthy sex? Well, I'll let you figure that out. And certainly unhealthy sex. By golly, I'm so upset about Mr. Brown's attention to my wife. I know what I'm going to do to escape. I'm going to go get on my computer and I'm going to look at some pornography. It affects My resentment towards Mr. Brown is the cause of my acting out. Social ambitions. Well, I don't want to be in the same room, in the same party, in the same office with Mr. Brown for that matter. It's affecting my social ambitions. Friends, this might be the first time in your life that you've ever looked at life this way, looked at people and institutions, and understood how they affect you, how they got you all angry, how you felt intimidated. And it's because of that. That's the reason why I act out. That's why the program invites us to consider the personality change we need. Why is this affecting me? How it is affecting me, and what am I doing with it? Let's continue on bottom of 65. It says, we went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we finished it, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that the people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were only short-lived. Bill continues on page 66. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But the pornaholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. You know, friends, what we're talking about is, we're looking for a spiritual experience. We're looking for a connection to the higher power, to the light of God. Resentment cuts us off from all of that. We're so involved in our own world. We can't look outside of ourselves, and we certainly can't look up to a higher power. That's what we're dealing with. He continues on the bottom of page 66. We turned back to the list, for it held the key to our future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. And that state, the wrongdoing of the others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than we can our porn addiction. So, here's the solution. Listen up. He says, we realized that people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, and this is known in our circles as the sick man prayer. We have every right, and I think it's important that when we see people that we have a resentment towards, we need to see them as having a spiritual sickness themselves. Remember, we discussed how we are in a battle between my will and everybody else's will. So what do we say when we're really sore? How can we get some form of relief from my resentment? By saying, this is a sick man or woman doing the best they can. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry. Thy will be done. Okay, so that's great. That's got us to a place where we can start to tolerate other people. But what can we do? What about our part in it? So that's why Bill gives us an introduction to column number 4, which is called, What's My Part in It? Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done to us, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though our situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to get these matters straight. I would bet that most of us have heard of the serenity prayer. Oh God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Now, before I learned step 4, I had this prayer all backwards. When I said, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, I thought that was talking about me. After all, I am who I am. How can I change myself? My way of thinking, etc., etc. I'm not here to change. And it said in the serenity prayer continues, the courage to change the things that I can. Well, that just means I need to put my willpower, be more courageous in changing people around me. That's why the third part of the serenity prayer says, in the courage to know the difference, because in truth, the serenity prayer is teaching me, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Well, that's everybody in column 1 and what they did to me in column 2. I can't change anybody else. And the courage to change the things that I can, well, that's just me. And I find that in column number 4, and the wisdom to know the difference. Because if I don't have the wisdom to know the difference, guess what? I'm going to sit on my pity pot in a boatload of resentment, and I will have no choice because I'm powerless over porn, and I will act out.